Let's start video. Record. All right. So I always start off, if there's any questions, insights about what we talked about last satsang, if there's any questions about self-inquiry or anything else that you'd like to ask.
Me.
Okay, Mary.
I did my homework.
Okay.
Because I had told you that I had listened partway through the first session that I was not present for.
Okay.
Neither was Brendan and Eileen. Alan was there. Alan and Dimitri.
Okay.
And there's something I didn't really understand.
Okay.
And I'm hoping I can ask the question in a way that I'm getting enough information to ask the question.
Okay.
But you were talking about the actual process that happens in inquiry.
Okay.
And there's a verse in the beginning about a distracted mind.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I should just read that. Here it is. Okay. If the mind is distracted, ask the question promptly, to whom do these distracting thoughts arise?
Mm-hmm.
That takes you back to the I point promptly. So then there was a discussion about that, and you said that in asking that question, it initiates, or it's part of a four-pronged process. So we call it a four-pronged process. And you said the first thing is asking the question.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing you said is that there is a mind. In other words, I guess it's seen that there's a mind, or this is what I don't know what you meant, but there's a mind.
Uh-huh.
And three is the place that the mind goes to. So I think that's, there's a perception that the mind goes someplace. And the fourth is the inferred place that it's supposed to come back to.
Right. Okay. Now,
so if you can elaborate on that.
Right. So at that time, we were talking about meditation, or talking about mindfulness, or talking about concentration. And all three of those are a variation on the theme of being in the present moment. And notionally, we can say there's always the present moment, which means that, or even ultimately, we can say that even if my mind's going in the future, that's what's supposed to be happening in this moment. Okay. That's a good pointer, and that can be helpful. But what I was offering is another pointer. So for example, going back to what I just said, you could be, sitting there and you're trying to meditate, and your mind goes on, like, I got a Monday morning meeting and I haven't prepared for it. And you say, oh, wow, I'm not in the present moment. I'm supposed to be concentrating. But according to the teaching, you are in the present moment. That is what's supposed to be happening, is your mind is going in the future and worrying about what's happening on what may happen on Monday. And so that can lead to acceptance and say, oh, okay, that's what's supposed to be happening. And then you either the worrying continues for a little bit, and you say, oh, okay, there's the mind going into the future, and that's being watched, and that's okay. And there's acceptance of that. And then the resistance that's involved in the mind going to the future is gone. And in my experience, it would go away with that pointer. So now he's offering another pointer, or at least I guess I was in a method of self-inquiry. So when you're sitting there and the same event happens, I'm worried about Monday morning meeting, and you just see what is going on. And what is going on is there's the four things, four phenomena going on when you are trying to concentrate. So what was number one? Because I want to do them in order.
Well, number one is asking a question.
Right. So so Ramana was asking, you know, what am I? That not so much who am I, but what am I? That was his self-inquiry. And so specifically with that is, well, what is it that's going into the future? Okay, so that'd be the first question. What's the first prong? What's the second?
The second thing was I'm adding the word, there's a recognition, but you just said there is a mind.
Right. So then you see that you would ask, what is this that's going into the future?
Wow.
What is it actually that's going into the future? Which the future doesn't exist yet. And so I'm starting to do an inquiry right now on this second prong approach. If I were meditating and I'd go, well, first of all, the future hasn't happened yet, so it's not even substantial. How weird is that? How interesting is that? And then what is it that's going into that future that doesn't even exist, really? So that's a line of inquiry that you become fascinated by that process. So right there, that would stop this mind going into the future. That's the second. And now the third one is?
The third one is the place that it goes to.
Right. So that's like, okay, this thing that I don't really know, and I kind of jumped ahead on the second one. This thing I don't really know, it's not an entity. I can't even see it, like my hand. It's not you know, in behaviorism, we call it private events, because I'm the only one that can observe the thoughts. Nobody else can observe my thoughts. So B.F. Skinner called it private events. So that goes with number two. It's like these private events are unique to who? Me. And what is that me? And so that's the second part. And then third, where's it going to? It's going to this ghost of an apparition of this illusion in the future. So that's the third prong. And then the fourth prong is?
The inferred place it's supposed to come back to.
Yeah, so then even coming back into this so-called quote unquote present moment, where is that? I mean, is the present moment only bracketed by my experience? So right now I'm in the present moment here, and I am not doing another activity like playing piano or cooking dinner or something like that. It usually doesn't happen that much. But even this, it's so confined. It's bracketed such like this. So what is that all about? And when you can tell that when those questions are asked in a spirit of true inquiry, it becomes fascinating. And the fascination coupled with a sense of surrender and of a mystery. It's not so much I'm going to get an answer from this, but just how unfathomable this whole thing is. How can I worry about the future in the context of this four-prong approach? And which can be used anytime.
Well, it's striking me the idea of the mind going anywhere, as if there's some place where it could go.
Right.
And yet, subjectively, it does seem as if it goes somewhere back.
Right.
So my question is, what's that? What creates that sense that the mind has gone somewhere, that it's like that somehow or other you're not present anymore? But that's what it feels like. Or you're caught, like the mind, the mind is caught up in a thought or something, totally absorbed in some thought about the Monday meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this, oh, but wait a minute, so something else happens that makes you feel it's somewhere other than where you are.
Right. So the interesting thing is let's say you're doing some kind of mindfulness or meditation, and you're sitting there, and there's a couple scenarios. One is there's a witnessing of that mind going into the future. And that's when I talked about a little later that the mind is going somewhere notionally into the future, and there's a witnessing of that. And then the other scenario is like you talked about, when you get absorbed in it and you come back and say, oh, I was worrying about this for the last 5 minutes or so. So when the second scenario is, how is it that you know, or what is it that knows that you were away from the present moment? That I was way in the future. What is it that knows? That even when you're supposedly gone, it knew that you were away. It's so fascinating. That's the thing to latch onto. What is it that knows while I'm away? That when I come back, I can say I was gone. And we're all kind of smiling and laughing because it's kind of funny and sort of unbelievable at the same time. And what we're pointing to is that which can never go away, that's always present. And that's what self-inquiry leads to. It's like, wait a minute, how did I know that I was away? There's a knowing there. That's always there, whether I'm away or not. Isn't it beautiful? Yes, Alan. Oh, yes.
The so-called present is no different than the so-called away, right? It's all just unfolding and in witnessing.
Well, we're pointing to there's a not so much something present, but there's awareness that's always there. Mm-hmm. Whether we, as a claiming me, false sense of authorship, the ego, is aware of itself or not, or let me say conscious, because that's what we've been using in the book. Mm-hmm. So there's a awareness that's always there, a knowing that's always there, regardless of whether there is the ego is conscious of itself or not.
I guess what I meant is when we say now I'm present, that's an idea about what's happening. Oh, I'm going to call this the present. I'm going to call that away. But everything's happening in the awareness. And we have these labels for what we're going to say is the real now and what's not real now.
So when you say I'm in the present, that's just the ego being conscious of itself. Because mm-hmm. I am being present. Mm-hmm. And so when the ego is away, then it's not aware of itself. Or conscious of itself. Let me stick with the language that we've been using. So it's either conscious of itself or not conscious of itself. But what I'm pointing to is a transcendent knowingness of whether the ego is conscious of itself or not conscious of itself. And those two are just pairs of opposites, conscious of itself or not conscious of itself. They drop away and there's simply a knowing. Let me unmute you, Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Now, ego conscious of itself.
What's that?
Well, you just said the ego conscious of itself, which
Mm-hmm.
seems like kind of a mind-boggling thing
Yeah.
to me. What does that really mean? Ego conscious of itself.
That there's, think of like Russian dolls. You can just say, oh, well, you know, you take one, it's like, I'm conscious of that part, whatever part. I'm conscious of this feeling. And then you say, well, what's conscious of that? And you take another doll out and say, well, I'm conscious of this. And it just goes on and on. There's no end to that. And so but there's a consciousness of a particular object, either of that object, the presence of that object, or when the ego is away, the absence. So if the absence and, okay. Either the absence of the ego, it's still in relation to this notional idea of ego. Either the presence of ego or absence of ego. Because when you're away, you say, oh, I was away. Who was away? The ego was away. That's the way you refer to it. I don't know if she's with us anymore.
I mean, I am. I mean, I feel like my mind circuits have been blown, so I don't know if that caused my picture to go away.
Mary, if you put your pointer in the bottom left corner of your screen, you might be able to hit something that says start video.
Oh, yeah. So why did it get stopped? Okay, that's beside the point. Okay, start video. I'm tapping it and it won't get rid of the arrow or the, you know.
So do you have any questions about that?
Well, it's like I couldn't follow it. I mean, my mind just went, it was like a short circuit. So I don't have a question.
Yeah, I mean, this takes time to think about.
Yeah, I'm going to have to listen to that again, that reply. Well, when you said the ego aware of the ego, the ego aware of itself, you didn't literally mean the ego is aware of itself, because the ego isn't awareness.
Well, that's why I switched it to conscious, because
Right.
in this book he refers to like body consciousness. You're conscious of your body, you're conscious of your mind, and you're conscious of the intellect.
So then is ego consciousness just that consciousness, is that consciousness of I am somebody here, I am here,
Yes.
I am, okay.
Ego consciousness would be conditioned consciousness, limited consciousness, however you want to refer to it, like that.
Okay.
Because why is it conditioned? It's conditioned because there's only consciousness of one particular thing, right? That's what we mean by conditioned. It's like I only can have one dessert. I only can be conscious of my hand, and then I can be conscious of my other hand, and I can be conscious of several objects, but it's all conditioned on something. It's based on the objects of consciousness, not on the subject of consciousness, which Ramana refers to is simply awareness, which is the source of our limited consciousness. Clear as mud?
A little clearer than it
I would just
was.
think of, you know, whenever we're identified most with the body through pain, then we're not conscious, we're not aware of anything else. We're just simply conscious of that pain for the most part. And there's little room for awareness, personal, total awareness.
And isn't that somewhat similar to that going off in the future, where a thought, because really when you're going off in the future, isn't that just a thought arising that becomes elaborate and chasing another thought and building a concept of the future? And the mind is focused there?
Yeah, if you're aware of it, yeah. If you're aware of like, oh, my mind is going on Monday morning meeting, and it just continues to go, and then that's how we tell the story. Yes, exactly. Like you add one thought on top of another and on top of another, and then you start telling a story. But you're still have conscious of that process with a small c. So you're still conscious of that telling of the story. So it becomes more of a focus on the story. I'm telling a story, I can't get my thoughts to stop, rather than one individual thought. I mean, the individual thoughts exist, but what is where the suffering comes in is that we can't stop this process. Like it feels like we turned off our car and the engine's still running. So whether the engine's running for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, we're still conscious of that process. And that's where suffering comes in, because we can't turn it off in our meditation or in our practice. So then when that's happening, we go back and ask, well, what is this, in this analogy I gave, what is the engine? And who's in the driver's seat that's watching the engine? And what is the car? Which the car is the body. So to pick out the thoughts would increase the identification. It's like, oh, the car's still running. And that's the main thing to focus on that's being focused on. The car is still running. But to start seeing how each thought goes on top of another, like you were talking about, is like, okay, I'm going to get out of the car now, look under the hood, and see how the serpentine belt is still going, and the pistons are still going, and analyzing it. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Don't forget the car's still going, the engine's still running. It's not so important to see which parts are going. The whole engine's going. And what is this engine? Or what is this mind? So that's where he says that self-inquiry is cutting things at the root, instead of analyzing a particular thought or analyzing a particular part in the engine. He's saying that the thing to do is, in that situation when the mind is running and running, is to see what is this mind or engine that's running. Uh-oh. Hey, Mary, can I ask you to mute your, and then unmute when you have a question?
Oh, okay, sure.
So the main thing is when you have the spirit of the self-inquiry, you end up become fascinated by this, the whole process. The engine, the panic of trying to shut off the engine diminishes and almost is eliminated completely, because you realize that I'm really not the one that turns off the engine. I'm not the one that has the power to turn off the engine. And I feel like I have the power by, most of the time I turn the key off and the engine will go off. And that seems like I have power, but there's a lot of times I turn the key off, turn the engine off, turn the key off, and it still goes on. And that's what the mind is like. And again, if we see, this was like the second prong, if we really see how this mind works, then we're noticing that there's very little correlation between me turning the key off and the engine going off at the same time. By correlation means there's if I turn it off, the key off, it could mean that the engine goes off, and it could mean that the engine continues. But I certainly cannot control it and turn it off. And then, so a next question in the inquiry would be like, well, then what do I do? Well, we just said, if you can't really turn it off and make the engine turn off all the time, then look at that question. What can I do? And then if you then you ask another question, it's like, well, I don't like to suffer. And then you'd say, well, is suffering something that we can eliminate, or the pain of the car, let's talk about, is that pain something I can eliminate from my life? And you'd say, well, wait a minute, pain and the opposite is part of duality. So, and then you ask, okay, then what do I do now? Well, we just said that you don't have much, or there's a little correlation between you turning off the key to the engine and the engine going off. So then you'd ask, well, then what does? Is there anything? And if there is anything, what does turn off? What is responsible for the engine going on and the engine going off? And it's just a inquiry, process of inquiry. So should I move on? Or any other questions about any other topic?
I have a question.
Okay.
So I was listening to last week's satsang,
Mhm.
and we were talking about, I might not say it right, Satchitananda,
Satchitananda, yes.
and how that is when notionally awareness first steps outside of itself, I think that's what you said.
Mhm.
And then we had this whole dialogue about experience, knowledge, and bliss. And we really talked about how there's existence, and then how things exist in existence, and that introduces a lot of concepts that could be laid on top of that, like time and duality. And then I thought, well, what are the concepts that can be on top of knowledge and bliss? And then I thought, well, what is knowledge and bliss? And what really is the difference between experience, knowledge, and bliss? And that was where I stopped.
Okay. So it's existence, knowledge, and bliss. So I may have said it wrong, but Satchidananda is existence, knowledge, and bliss. And so.
Oh no, I was saying it wrong. Sorry, existence.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this idea is something that I heard Ramesh talk about back in 1987 when I heard his first talk in LA. And he had this little diagram, and if you have the book Experiencing the Teaching, I believe it's in Experiencing the Teaching, he has this diagram of circles, and they form another circle until with arrows, and there might even be squares in there. But he's showing the process of how there is what he would call consciousness at rest and consciousness in motion. And as soon as there's consciousness in motion, there's manifestation of pure consciousness at rest. Or pure consciousness at rest is also pure subjectivity. And Nisargadatta talks about this too. He talks about how the world and the universe is created. So this is a pointer to think about, well, how is this whole universe created? And what's the difference between the manifested universe and that pure subjectivity that's at rest? So what Ramesh did was broke it down into a lot of stages. And he said there's first consciousness at rest, and it's the same thing as pure subjectivity, which you would say that pure subjectivity means that it's not aware of itself. And why would we say it's not aware of itself? Well, as soon as something's aware of itself, it has to have another part to itself to be aware. So you have to be aware of, there's awareness of awareness. And so in that phase or first stage, consciousness, pure consciousness or pure subjectivity is aware of itself. Now, traditionally what Vedanta would say is that first step outside of itself is made up of three qualities. And those three qualities are existence, knowledge, and bliss. And it's best to not think of them as three silos, but as more of a three prongs interweaving. So you are able to think about how things exist. So in the knowledge part is the knowing, which we talked about with the self-inquiry a little earlier today. So there's a knowing that the mind has been away and has come back, and there's a knowing that the mind is present and agitated. Okay? So that's the knowing part. The bliss part refers to the absence of any pain or suffering. So when that happens, it happens when the deep sleeper exists, because there's an absence of any identification of the waker. And the waker, you can just say equals ego. So that's why they call it the bliss sheath. The deep sleep state is the absence of the waker or the ego, and that is called the bliss sheath. Which the bliss exists, again, it can't be confined by a state of consciousness, but it's more apparent that we can see that it's in the deep sleep state. The key is that defines it is the absence of the identification with the ego. And that's why when there's mystical experiences and the ego is not there, we call it a blissful experience. Now, all those three qualities point to something that's underlying the changing universe. So it's the hand or the substratum that supports everything that's changing. Let's just take the mind. So the mind is maybe in the present moment, maybe goes in the past, maybe goes in the future, but the mind is still existing, but it's being supported by this idea of Satchit Ananda, which is the unmanifest. And by unmanifest, it can't be experienced by the physical eye. It's not an intellectual knowing. And so the times when there's a mystical experience, the ego is temporarily gone. And all there is this awareness of awareness. And so depending on the quality of the body-mind mechanism, when that experience ends and the ego comes back, is like, oh, I was blissed out. Or there was just a presence there. That would be another interpretation of that. Or there is simply knowing or knowledge. And that would be how the ego would interpret that experience, mystical experience.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So what was helpful is when I didn't understand what Ramesh was talking about in 87, but I didn't forget that diagram. And notionally, it's like, oh, okay, it's consciousness steps outside of itself. There's Satchit Ananda, and then at some point there's identification with the body, name, and form. And then for some body-mind mechanisms, there's seeking starts, and then there's self-inquiry starts, and then eventually there's the consciousness or awareness goes back into itself, and there's a completion. And that is just one way to conceptualize the seeking, how it starts, the process, and how it ends. And I found it extremely helpful for me. Any questions on that? Is that
No, that's great. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So I think we were on a new chapter. So in chapter 5, he talks about the seer, S-E-E-R. And the questioner says, who am I? How is it to be found? Question mark. Maharishi, ask yourself the question, the body and its functions are not I. Going deeper, the mind and its functions are not I. The next step takes one on to the question, wherefrom do these thoughts arise? The thoughts are spontaneous, superficial, or analytical. They operate in intellect. Then who's aware of them? The existence of thoughts, their clear conception and their operations become evident to the individual. The analysis leads to the conclusion that the individuality of the person is operative as the perceiver of the existence of thoughts and of their sequence. So Brendan was asking earlier about this, basically the sequence, the thoughts and of their sequence. This individuality is the ego, or as people say, I. Intellect is only the sheath of I, and not the I itself. Inquiring further, the question arises, who is this I? Wherefrom does it come? Now, I would probably say, inquiring further, the questions arise, what is this I? To keep it impersonal. And where does it come from? I was not aware in deep sleep, in deep dreamless sleep. Simultaneously with its rise, deep dreamless sleep changes to dream or wakefulness. But I'm not concerned with dream just now. So now he's going back to that pointer of the 3 states of consciousness. You are not concerned with the dream right now. Nor if you had won the lottery in the dream last night, does it have much use today? If I originated from deep dreamless sleep, then I was covered up with ignorance. Such an ignorant I cannot be what the scriptures say or the wise ones affirm. I am beyond even sleep. I must be now and here and what I was all along in deep dreamless sleep and dreams also, without the qualities of such states. I must therefore be unqualified substratum underlying these 3 states. So that was the hand I was referring to. I is in brief beyond the 5 sheets. Next, the residuum left over after discarding all that is not self is the self, Satchidananda, being awareness and bliss. So I'm glad Ramana has my back a little bit here, talking exactly about what we are referring to. So, so when I look at this, I would probably feel overwhelmed reading this whole thing because it has all the concepts of Advaita Vedanta all within 2 pages, and it's like it's like this. I was listening to a piece by Stravinsky, which is under a minute, and I believe it's 3 pieces for string quartet, and it's the first movement. It's under 56 seconds, but in that piece, when I've heard an analysis of it, all his technique, everything that he would go on and compose is within that 56 seconds. And so that's what this is here to me, is like everything that the whole Bhagavad Gita, all the Upanishads are in this 2 pages here. And so what I would do when I was reading is when I started feeling overwhelmed, then I would stop and say, okay, that's like a bookmark. and I would stop there and try to go back and figure from where I started until I started getting overwhelmed. So the question is, what am I, and how is it to be found? And so Maharishi says, ask yourself the question: the body and its functions are not I. So I would think, okay, it's easier to see at the gross level this idea of something that changes and something that doesn't change. So that's how I would start the inquiry. Because it'd say, well, why does he start at the body level? The body level, because it's easy to see that in the last 3 years, I have a lot more gray hair than I did, 3 or 4 years ago. But I'm not my gray hair. But that's changing. And so I go deeper and then say, well, what about the mind and its functions? And he's saying that's also not I, because the I is changing. I mean, the mind is changing. But he's saying there's something that doesn't change. It's the same thing that we were talking about earlier, is there's something that sees the mind go away and the mind coming back. And then where from do these thoughts arise? Even though the thoughts may be spontaneous, superficial, or analytical, he's saying they operate in the intellect. So he's giving you that piece of information. So here he's saying, if any thought arises, view it right now as coming from this notional place called the intellect. Just for right now. Because the reason why he wants to know that, us to know that it's from the intellect, is that then we start putting in this idea of, well, who's aware of the existence of those thoughts? And then, so that's how he sets it up. So going from the body, the mind, and the intellect. And asking, what is it that's aware of the changes in the body, changes in the mind, and changes in the intellect? You following me so far? Okay. So then he says, the existence of thoughts, their clear conception, and their operations become evident to the individual. The analysis leads to the conclusion that the individuality of the person is operative as the perceiver of the existence of thoughts and of their sequence. This individuality is the ego, or as people say, I. Okay, so I'll read that again. This analysis leads to the conclusion that the individuality of the person is operative as the perceiver of the existence of the thoughts and of the sequence. So this is exactly what Mary was talking about earlier. So he's saying that the ego is aware, I shouldn't say aware, that the ego is conscious of itself. It perceives its own thoughts. That's what he's saying. This individuality is the ego. And so this is where it helps to know that there's 5 sheets. So Vedanta teaches there's 5 sheets. There's the food sheath, there's the prana sheath, there's the mind sheath, the intellectual sheath, which he's referring to here, and the bliss sheath. So there's 5 sheaths. And so when the ego is conscious of its thoughts, the intellect is only the sheath of I and not the I itself. So it's not the subjective I. So simply observing one's thoughts, that observer, he's saying, is not pure subjectivity. It's just taking one Russian doll off and saying, oh, there's the thoughts. So that's a handful right there. There's a mouthful right there. Any questions about that? So the trick is the sense of personal doership, or the sense of the false sense of authorship, is so strong that we don't realize that when we're observing our own thoughts, it's just the sense of personal doership doing that. That's why sitting in meditation and in just observing your thoughts, if you do that for 15 minutes, it's actually just letting the sense of personal doership run. It's like sitting in the car and saying, I need to turn this car off, as if I have the power to do it. So that's how he's setting it up.
I'm confused.
Okay.
So, because of the idea I have gotten previously that pure subjectivity is ultimately the perceiver of everything. Pure subjectivity or consciousness.
So what do you mean ultimately?
Oh, I'm thinking of like the Upanishads, that thing about that which hears.
Mm-hmm.
So I always thought that which hears is not the individual, that the individual is claiming it, but that it was actually not the individual.
Right. So that probably ultimately would be something that you would get as an understanding, having gone through the whole process of inquiry. But right now, he's halfway through. So you could say ultimately, but right now, he's halfway through the process.
So this is a step of understanding.
This is, to me, a very beautiful, logical, step-by-step way of doing it. And it's very condensed. And so without much background, you wouldn't say, well, is only the sheath. What's a sheath? So you have to fill in, oh, there's 5 sheets. And what does that mean, that there's 5 sheets? And then on your second point with the Upanishads, in that particular verse, it's talking about a similar but a slightly different pointer, and that is that Upanishad is trying to get your awareness or consciousness off of the object, but on the source of what's giving you the power to perceive or see or hear. So you say, it's not what I hear, but that which makes me hear. So when you say it that way, the me becomes more of an instrument, an intermediate of the experience. And there's something beyond me that gives me that power. So it's similar, but slightly different pointer.
Okay, that helps.
Good. So now we got this idea that the ego is simply, because right now you could say, well, there is no ego. The ego doesn't exist. You could say that, but he's trying to take us step by step. it's like, let's just go to dessert. He's got us the appetizer, and he's got us the drinks, and now he's setting up with salad, and now we're getting to the main course, and then we can finish it off with dessert. But he's taking us step by step, and so right now we're kind of like starting our main course with who is this I? So he says the intellect is the only sheath of I and not the I itself. So when you're observing your own thoughts, it's just the intellect sheath functioning. And so then he's saying, okay, inquiring further, the question arises, who is this I? Wherefrom does it come from? And then this is where it's really beautiful. If you know the 5 sheaths, he's going from the intellectual sheath to the bliss sheath. So he's taken us, he's left out the prana, the breath, but he's going from if you think of the sheaths as the body sheath as the outer circle, the prana sheath is smaller, exists within it, the mind smaller, the intellect even smaller, and then the middle is bliss sheath. So he's trying to take us notionally that way. And so now he's taking us from the intellect, and the intellect is now going into the deep dreamless sleep. So he's going in a very logical fashion. You have a question, Brendan?
Yeah, something that's a little confusing. He says the individuality is the ego, or as people say, I. Intellect is only the sheath of I, and not the I itself. Inquiring further, the questions arise, who is this I? So the individuality is not I, but he means the ego I, right?
Yes.
Thing to there. Intellect is only the sheath of the ego.
Of ego, yes.
Right? So then when we do the sheaths, the bliss sheath, it goes from intellect to bliss, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But isn't bliss the lack of ego?
That's what he's getting to.
So I'm a little confused where the intellect is the sheath of ego.
Mm-hmm.
So ego is like something between intellect and bliss sheath.
You think of it as the ego or the intellectual sheath comes out of the bliss sheath like a seed, which is the deep sleep state, or bliss sheath. There's a little sprout, and that's the intellect, the intellectual sheath.
Mm-hmm. But what's the confusing to me is the use of intellect is only the sheath of I, the ego.
Yes.
So when we talk about if intellect is a sprout from the bliss sheath, where does ego come in that whole idea of the sheaths, that concept?
Okay, so say it again. I'm not quite.
So when he talks about, if we take the sheaths and you think of them as concentric within one another, right? Where the gross, the body, the food body,
Mm-hmm.
mind, intellect getting down, narrower, and then the bliss sheath.
Mm-hmm.
Here he's saying intellect is the sheath of the ego.
Mm-hmm.
Yet
Yes.
within that is the bliss sheath or causal body or whatever you want to call it. To me, isn't that a lack of an ego, right? Is that within that sheath?
Right.
So somewhere between the intellect and the bliss sheath, ego is, or is it outside of all of that?
It doesn't exist yet.
I think what's confusing is the first line that says, this individuality is the ego, or as people say, capital quote, I. And but that doesn't, like, when he's talking about it further, and he's saying it's not the I itself, isn't that I, that large capital I that he's talking about, like, supposed to be like awareness or subjective awareness or something like that? Or is that ego?
Well, he says the intellect is only the sheath of I and not the I itself.
But the one before it is what's confusing to me. It says, or as people say, I. What is that?
The
Capital
ego.
I with the quotes. That's ego. That's
That's
all the I's are ego.
yes, but then he says the intellect is only the sheath of I, which is ego there, and not the I, which is pure subjectivity itself. I know it's confusing.
So the I actually changes meanings in the three sentences.
In that one sentence, it sounds like intellect is only the sheath of I,
Not
but he's saying, but the sheath of ego with that use of I, right?
Mhm.
not the
And
I.
not the I itself.
And that I is
But
different.
I don't think that I is different. He's saying intellect is only the sheath of the ego and not the ego itself.
I think that I is not just pure subjectivity itself.
So it says the individuality is the ego, or as people say, I. So now, so he's saying this I, capital I, is the ego. And then he's saying intellect is only the sheath of I and not the I itself. So the sheath, the reason why it's, so you're asking is that you think it's big I, or you think it's small I?
Eileen thinks it's big I.
I don't know.
I think it's
I'm
confused.
completely confused.
I think then the use of small I in here with the whole concept of sheaths is where I'm trying to see where does that fit in the concept of the sheaths, the small I. If the sheath goes from intellect to bliss sheath, there's no ego in there.
Right.
And so, but intellect is only the sheath of small I and not the I itself. Almost seems like it should go intellect, ego, bliss sheath.
Maybe it's not small I. Maybe it's supposed to be large I.
The
First one should be small
the idea is to disidentify. So the intellect is ego.
Okay, and that makes sense to me. But it's the use here of intellect is only the sheath of I, ego.
So the intellect sheath is ego, is the made up of intellect, which is ego. That's what he's saying.
Okay.
So all out of the 5 sheaths, there's 4 that are ego dependent on the ego. And it's the 5th one that is the absence of the ego. And that's what he's trying to point to in the next couple sentences. Yes, Alan.
That makes sense to me because we say my body, my breath, as if the ego owns those, and my intellect, it was body, breath. What was the third one?
Mind.
Mind and intellect. We all can say my about those, so the ego grasps those and identifies with them, but we don't say my bliss. The ego is gone at that point.
Right. Right. And nor do we say, I had a peaceful sleep last night. Mm-hmm. I had a dreamless sleep last night. Mm-hmm. We don't say, I am that peaceful peace that exists mm-hmm. in dreamless, in the dreamless state. Mm-hmm. So this identification, to go from disidentification from the intellectual sheath to the bliss sheath is like a giant leap. Mm-hmm. And that's why, to me, he's doing it very methodically, step by step. So he's saying, okay, the ego exists in all the four sheets, and how do I get to this state of the dreamless sleep? And then how do I even go beyond that? There's two more steps. And so he's saying, inquiring further, the question arises, who is this, or what is this ego, and where does the ego come from? That's the question right there. So where does this ego come from? If it exists in those four sheets, where does it come from? And what is it? And so he uses the deep sleep state as, I was not aware or the ego is not aware of itself in deep dreamless sleep. Simultaneously with its rise of the ego, or deep dreamless sleep, changes to dream or wakefulness. So he's saying that there's the absence of the ego in deep sleep, or in the bliss sheath, and then it changes and arises out of this deep sleep and becomes the dreamer and the waker. But then he's saying, well, as a waker, I'm not concerned with the dream right now. And so I'm negating the dream state. So then what am I, or who am I, or what am I now in this waking state? And then he goes on to talk a little bit about, then he starts to talk about this deep sleep state. So any questions about up until now? Because this is a lot to digest. So if you are having trouble getting up to this point, then the rest won't make sense. So what I would suggest is read over that part and start thinking about this idea of the ego is the intellectual sheath, because that's what's setting up everything else. That's where he's trying to negate the he's going to use negation.
That makes sense to me, what you just said. The ego is the intellectual sheath. The way it's worded here made it seem like the intellect is a sheath of I, as if it's not the intellectual sheath, but something around the intellectual, around ego. The intellect is something around ego, or outside of ego. That's how it seemed worded to me there, and that's what it was.
Right. So that's a good line of inquiry if you want to think about what do these sheets cover up? Because that's what he's talking to us. I'm glad you got it, because that's going to be the next part. He's going to ask, what do the sheets cover up? Including the bliss sheath. The bliss sheath covers up something.
This is where I've been stuck for years.
What?
This is where I've been stuck for years. Ever since you introduced the sheath concepts to me, I'm stuck at this point.
Well, join the club because I was stuck in it.
Okay.
You're in good company.
For a good 13 years or so.
Oh, no.
That's awesome.
So,
We're going to have a lot of time together.
but I had to understand it first before I let it go. So you have to understand it first before you let it go. So I'm glad you got this idea of the ego is the intellectual sheath, and that because that'll be easier. Because what the inquiry will lead to is that you won't be able to know. And the short answer is you won't be able to know it because it's the ego from the intellectual sheath trying to understand something that is more subtle, and it's impossible. And I knew that.
I get that at a conceptual level, but you keep going for it, like the dog going at that bone.
Right. And I did that too. And I did it for a long time until I realized, I'm not going to get it. And I realized that, I'm not gonna understand it because it's the ego at the intellectual sheath trying to understand something more subtle. But at the same time, it was like, yeah, I know I got to stop doing this particular behavior, but I can't do it. I want to do it. But what happens is in the inquiry, something finally takes over where the effort continues to be there. The earnestness continues to be there, or perseverance, whatever you want to call it. The willingness continues to be there. And at some point, the light bulb switches on. You say, hey, I'm really not going to be able to get this. And now the understanding moves from the intellectual level, which is the intellectual sheath, beyond it, where there's simply a knowing which you can't claim. So I can't claim anything that I'm speaking about today because it's coming more subtle than the intellectual level. So I can blame it on pure consciousness. Good or bad, whether you understand or not, it's beyond the intellectual sheath. And any knowing you really have is not coming from, the intellectual sheath. It's coming from something beyond that. Mary, you still there?
Yes.
Okay. All right, we covered a lot. This is some heavy stuff. So we'll have the video posted next week, and this is a good one to listen over a few times. Yeah. And then so read the next page. I think you have enough on your own to see how he's trying to show that what we're talking about is even beyond the bliss sheath. All right. Namaste, everyone.
Namaste.
Yay.